Snow White, A Brothers Grimm Fairy Tale. Snow White lived in a grand castle with her kind father, the king. One winter day, soft snowflakes floated down from the sky. Snow covered the trees, the rooftops, and the hills like a fluffy white blanket. Snow White loved to sit by the window and watch the snow sparkle in the sunlight. As she grew older, everyone noticed how gentle and cheerful she was. Her skin was fair like snow, her cheeks were rosy, and her dark hair shone like silk. But more than anything, people loved her kind heart. After some time, the king married a new queen. The queen was very beautiful, and she cared greatly about being the fairest person in the land. Every day she looked into her magical mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror, tell me true, who is the fairest in the land?" And the mirror always answered, "You are the fairest in the land." The queen smiled whenever she heard those words. But as the years passed, Snow White became more lovely each day. One morning, the queen asked her mirror the same question again. This time, the mirror replied, "Snow White is the fairest in the land." The queen did not like hearing this at all. She became jealous and unhappy. She decided she did not want Snow White nearby anymore. So one day, Snow White was taken far into the forest. But the servant who brought her there could not be cruel to such a gentle child. He told her softly, "Run along and stay safe." Snow White thanked him and wandered through the woods. Tall trees swayed gently in the breeze. Little birds chirped above her, and squirrels skipped across the branches. Though she felt lonely, the forest was peaceful and calm. As evening came, Snow White saw a tiny cottage tucked between the trees. Warm light glowed from the windows. Inside, everything was neat and cozy. There were 7 tiny chairs, 7 tiny bowls, and 7 tiny beds lined up side by side. Snow White was very tired. She tasted a tiny bite from each plate, so she would not take too much. Then she curled up on the softest little bed and fell fast asleep. Soon, the owners of the cottage came home. They were 7 dwarfs who worked together in the mountains during the day. They noticed little things out of place. "Someone has been sitting here," one said. "And someone tasted my soup," said another. Then they discovered Snow White asleep in the little bed. Instead of being upset, the dwarfs smiled kindly. "What a sweet child," they whispered. In the morning, Snow White woke and told them her story. The dwarfs listened carefully. They felt sorry for her and invited her to stay with them. "You may live here with us," they said, "and we will take care of one another." Snow White happily agreed. From then on, the cottage became a joyful home. Each morning, the dwarfs walked to the mountains to work. Snow White tidied the cottage, baked bread, swept the floor, and sang cheerful songs while birds fluttered nearby. In the evenings, they all shared warm suppers together. The little cottage was filled with laughter and candlelight. But back at the castle, the queen once again asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror, tell me true, who is the fairest in the land?" The mirror answered, "Snow White is still the fairest in the land." The queen was surprised. She realized Snow White was alive and living somewhere in the forest. So the queen disguised herself and traveled to the dwarf's cottage. She pretended to be a traveling peddler, carrying pretty ribbons and combs. Snow White remembered the dwarves' warning to be careful, but the visitor seemed friendly and harmless. The queen offered Snow White gifts and tricks that made her feel sleepy and weak. Each time the dwarfs returned home just in time to help Snow White feel better again. After that, they gently reminded her, "Always be careful, dear Snow White." Snow White promised she would. Still, the queen would not give up. One day she arrived carrying a bright red apple that looked shiny and delicious. Snow White hesitated, but the apple smelled sweet, and the old woman spoke kindly. Snow White took one small bite. At once she fell into a deep, quiet sleep. When the dwarfs came home, they found her resting peacefully among the flowers. They tried to wake her, but she stayed asleep. The dwarfs loved Snow White very much. They placed her in a beautiful glass bed, surrounded by flowers, so they could watch over her gently. Birds perched nearby, singing soft songs each morning. And there Snow White rested peacefully, as though she were dreaming the sweetest dream. Many days later, a prince traveling through the forest came upon the cottage. When he saw Snow White, he was filled with sadness and wonder. "She looks as though she is only sleeping," he said softly. As the prince and the dwarfs carefully moved the glass bed, the tiny piece of apple slipped free. Snow White opened her eyes slowly and took a deep breath. The dwarfs cheered with joy. The birds fluttered happily through the trees. Snow White smiled as she looked around at all the friendly faces. The prince spoke kindly to her, and the two became dear friends. Soon Snow White visited the prince's beautiful castle, where gardens bloomed with roses and fountains sparkled in the sun. At last, Snow White found a happy new home filled with kindness, friendship, and peace. And the queen? Over time, she learned that beauty is never as important as kindness and love. As for Snow White, she never forgot the 7 dwarfs who cared for her in the little forest cottage. She visited them often, and together they shared many warm evenings beside the fire. And so Snow White, the prince, and all their friends lived happily for many, many years beneath the stars.